supposed to do it. Thanks.
Thank you.
We are once again live.
I think we're live. Are we ready?
Yeah, we should be good.
All right.
And then you've got presenter view. It's clicked into this, so you've got that. And then you should be able to...
Try spacebar, but...
Spacebar, yeah, but you can also do left and right to go forward and backwards if you want to.
Wonderful.
Right.
And then this is your mic. I'll be adjusting the audio here.
Okay, that shouldn't be a problem.
Take it away, Brad.
Okay, hi everybody. The research my co-authors and I are presenting today builds upon more than 30 years of work devoted to identifying the original cultural context of Ohio's Great Serpent Mound. Why is that so important? Serpent Mound is Ohio's most famous mound and is literally the poster child for Ohio's and Eastern North America's ancient indigenous earthworks. So it's a little embarrassing that there is still disagreement over its age and therefore its cultural context. And placing it within its cultural context is necessary to even begin to understand its meaning for the indigenous American Indians who built it as a place of ceremony and devotion. The crux of this presentation is that Ohio rock art can help situate the iconography of Serpent Mound into a late pre-contact Fort Ancient cultural context. Ohio has relatively little rock art when compared to other regions of North America. For much of the state, there are few exposed bedrock outcrops that could have served as canvases for the art, and rock art on outcrops along rivers is subject to potential erosion. So the overall rarity of rock art in the state may be why it is often neglected in studies of Ohio's indigenous history. But James Swager, between 1997 and 1984, undertook a comprehensive investigation of Ohio's rock art, which resulted in the 1984 publication of Petroglyphs of Ohio, still the most complete compilation of Ohio rock art available. Swager documented rock art locations and looked for relationships between designs and particular environmental features, such as their proximity to water. He concluded that Ohio's Aboriginal rock art was created during the late pre-contact period and proposed that the creators were Proto-Shawnee. He was, however, adamant that any attempt to recover the meaning of the designs was a trip to Never Never Land. He did allow that if one could discuss the rock art with the descendants of those who created them, then it might be possible to elucidate those meanings. However, he also cautioned that two Navajo men with whom he had worked during World War II had told him they much enjoyed making up stories for anthropologists. In this same vein, Swager claimed that an Eastern Shawnee man informed him that his people are polite enough always to give a researcher an answer to a question concerning a symbol, but the answer will not be a correct answer, for the correct answer conveys power to the questioner. In our work with Indigenous American Indian colleagues, however, we have not found any suggestion of this sort of dissimulation. Moreover, we agree with Louis Binford's optimistic assessment that we have no notion of what are the limitations of the archaeological record with regard to the information potentially recoverable, and that there is every reason to suspect that we could develop ways of extracting from the archaeological record information regarding properties of cultural systems, including social and ideological components. By the way, today is Louis Binford's birthday, so wherever you are, Lou, happy birthday. At any rate, Swager's position appears to have softened somewhat over the years, since a 1997 volume on Kentucky petroglyphs, for which he is listed as a co-author, essentially concedes Binford's point with the somewhat less than enthusiastic statement that the possibility of interpretation of the Kentucky sites exists. Okay. In this paper, we use methods pioneered by co-authors Diaz, Granados, and Duncan, as well as by other participants in the Texas State Mississippian Iconography Workshop. We identify recurrent sets of motifs at rock art sites and link them with stories from the traditions of American Indian tribes known to have historic associations with the regions in which the rock art occurs. Serpent Mound long has been viewed as a monumental sculpture of a snake, and it certainly is that. Some archaeologists have recognized that it is rather more than that. John McLean, one of the first archaeologists to survey and map Serpent Mound, identified a wishbone-shaped mound at the head of the serpent that he interpreted as a separate effigy of a frog. Frederick Putnam, the Harvard archaeologist who is most responsible for saving the mound from obliteration and for his extensive investigations at the site, also identified the wishbone-shaped mound, but ultimately dismissed it without much explanation, perhaps because it conflicted with his preferred interpretation that the effigy was a serpent with an egg in its mouth, and the wishbone-shaped mound confused that. My colleagues and I agree with McLean that the wishbone-shaped mound was an integral part of the original sculpture, but disagree with his interpretation of the mound as a frog effigy. Our new interpretation of the iconography of Serpent Mound began to take shape in 2015 when I first read Diaz-Granados's and Duncan's book on Picture Cave. I tentatively identified 3 motifs from the main panel of pictographs that appeared to echo the 3 components of Serpent Mound: the serpent, an oval, and the wishbone-shaped motif. Shortly thereafter, Diaz-Granados and Duncan came to Denison University to give a presentation on rock art. I attended the program, and afterwards I approached them with my crazy idea. Much to my surprise, they enthusiastically agreed that the motifs did indeed appear to be telling the same story. Their interpretations of the Picture Cave pictographs developed in the course of conducting ethnographic research with the Osage. Picture Cave is located on Osage ancestral lands, and several of the older men and women offered interpretations of the Picture Cave imagery. Duncan and Diaz-Granados ultimately concluded that the Picture Cave panels present the Dagiasuan creation story, the making of the earth. The narrative involves first man, who dwelt in the sun. He and several star companions had been challenged to a celestial stickball game by the great serpent, lord of the beneath world, and his children. First man was defeated, and the victors cut off his head. The grandsons of First Man, Stone and Black Wolf, retaliated by attacking the great serpent with powerful weapons and regalia provided by their grandmother, First Woman. They defeated the great serpent and recovered their grandfather's head. The great serpent then became the consort of First Woman, and as a result of their sexual relations, First Woman acquired his powers of regeneration, which she then used to create all life on Earth. We think both Picture Cave and the corresponding imagery at Serpent Mound are icons depicting this pivotal moment in the making of the Earth's story. The serpent is the great serpent, the wishbone-shaped mound is First Woman, and the oval is the symbolically exaggerated vulva of First Woman. That exaggeration may relate to the fact that First Woman's vulva became the portal where the spirits of the dead began their journey. After our paper on Serpent Mound and Picture Cave, co-authored with soil scientist Todd Frolking, was published, Ernie Bojart, an authority on the effigy mounds of the upper Midwest, reached out to us with the provocative suggestion that an effigy mound group in Wisconsin might also be telling the same, or at least a closely related story, as the one being told at Picture Cave and Serpent Mound. The Willow Drive Mound Group in Madison, Wisconsin, includes a serpent creature or possibly an underwater panther, a wishbone-shaped anthropomorph, a small circular mound, and a bird effigy. The various elements of this mound group and their configurations suggest it is indeed a vignette in a story related to the stories being told on the walls of Picture Cave and at Serpent Mound. We presented the results of our collaboration earlier this year in the North American Archaeologist. In that paper, we considered other rock art in Missouri as well as Wisconsin that exhibited many of these same motifs. We identified several co-occurrences of serpent and vulva motifs in mound groups and rock art that pointed to a widespread adoption of a set of related oral traditions and a consistent vocabulary of motifs used to represent those stories. We did not, however, consider the potential of rock art in Ohio to provide additional evidence for the widespread use of these motifs across the mid-continent. I think we just assumed, incorrectly as it turns out, that the rock art record in Ohio was too limited to bother with. Eventually, though, we decided to take a look, since finding such evidence in Ohio would provide additional support for the proposition that the iconography of Serpent Mound was not an early woodland anomaly, but was rather truly iconic imagery firmly embedded in a Mississippian cultural context. Swager determined that of the 61 reported petroglyph sites that he investigated in Ohio, 35 were acceptable as Native American in origin. There is, however, some duplication in this number, since, for example, the East Liverpool petroglyph site is the same as the Babbs Island petroglyph site. In addition, Swager included sites for which we have no reliable data concerning what was carved on them. Such sites were useful for Swager's work, since the data were sufficient to note the reported locations in relation to bodies of water. But we exclude them from this review since we are principally concerned with iconography. This leaves 18 sites that are Native American petroglyphs for which we have reliable information on at least some of the imagery. To this list, we have added 2 additional petroglyph sites which are documented on the Ohio Archaeological Inventory. 5 of these 20 sites, Independent Slab, Babbs Island, Dam Number 8, Leo Petroglyph, and the Barnesville Track Rocks, include imagery of serpents with or without vulvar motifs. 2 additional sites, Saxon Petroglyph and Council Rock, exhibit vulvar motifs without serpents. The Independent Slab in Cuyahoga County is a portion of a petroglyph panel that was removed from its original position on a hillside and installed in a wall of the Independence Presbyterian Church. The central and dominant motif in the slab is a 2.4 meter long serpent, which we interpret as a representation of the Great Serpent. The Babbs Island petroglyph site is located on a sandstone ledge in the Ohio River near East Liverpool in Columbiana County. The petroglyphs include a variety of beneath-world beings, including a serpentine creature with antlers. It is associated with 2 anthropomorphs, one that appears to be an extension of the serpentine body. Alternatively, it may represent the serpent transforming into human form. The other is next to the first and is more human-like. They appear to be reaching out to one another. In addition, there are a number of vulvar motifs, including concentric ovals, circles, and open circles. We interpret the serpentine creature with antlers to be a representation of the Great Serpent, based on its similarity to an image of the Great Serpent at Picture Cave. The anthropomorph with human feet may depict First Woman, and their overlap may indicate that they are engaged or are about to be engaged in sexual intercourse. The vulvar motifs are additional symbolic references to First Woman. Unfortunately, Swager only shows the various petroglyphs as separate motifs and not as they relate to each other in the overall composition. As a result, we can identify the powerful beneath-world imagery, but are unable to determine how the vulvar motifs relate to the serpentine creature. The Dam Number 8 petroglyphs also are on a sandstone ledge along the Ohio River, near the Babbs Island petroglyphs. The glyphs include a so-called rattlesnake that is approximately 1.4 meters long and which we interpret as a depiction of the Great Serpent. There are, in addition, 4 somewhat smaller beneath-world beings and 4 anthropomorphs, but as with the Babbs Island petroglyphs, Swager only shows separate motifs and not the overall composition. The Leo petroglyph panel is on a sandstone bedrock exposure in Jackson County. The overall composition is dominated by an anthropomorphic face with horns or antlers on its head and bird's feet extending below the jaw. The entire glyph is more than a meter long. Below this enigmatic figure, however, there is a U-shaped vulvar glyph and a serpent that is nearly a meter long. We interpret these 2 figures as a vignette that is comparable to Serpent Mound's depiction of First Woman about to engage in coitus with the Great Serpent. The Barnesville Track Rocks are 2 sandstone boulders exposed on a hilltop in Belmont County that are covered with dozens of glyphs, including 4 serpents, one of which is less than a meter away from 3 concentric ovals. This serpent is more closely associated with a partial anthropomorphic face and 2 angular frog-like or turtle-like figures. We interpret this complicated set of glyphs as an episode during the encounter between the Great Serpent and First Woman, who is represented here by the vulvoid ovals and perhaps the anthropomorphic face as well. The Council Rock petroglyphs are located in Morgan County in a location that Swager never visited. The images on the sandstone boulder include a 6-legged salamander-like creature, which is likely a beneath-world being related to the Great Serpent or the underwater panther. In addition, there is an incomplete circle that may represent a vulva. Swager speculated that this glyph might have been part of a historic period tar burner or lye leaching stone, but he did finally conclude that it was acceptable as Native American. It is placed alongside the six-legged creature as well as two other animals that might also be denizens of the beneath world. The Saxon petroglyphs are in Meigs County on an extensive sandstone ledge. The imagery includes at least two anthropomorphs, two fish, a turtle, a bird, an underwater panther, and two ovals with bisecting lines across the long axes, which we interpret as vulvar motifs that reference first woman. And perhaps the underwater panther is the lord of the beneath world in this variant of the story. Once again, Swager was only able to show the various petroglyphs as separate motifs and not as they relate to each other in the overall composition due to limitations of the data available to him. In conclusion, this overview demonstrates that Ohio rock art does include motifs and sets of motifs that reoccur in rock art throughout the mid-continent as well as in the forms of effigy mounds in Ohio and Wisconsin. Swager concluded that Ohio petroglyphs were carved sometime during the period between AD 900 and 1750, which encompasses the radiocarbon dates for all the reliably dated effigy mounds in the mid-continent. There is some debate over the age of Serpent Mound, but the most reliable dates from the mound indicate an age of around AD 1100. Moreover, the peculiar iconography of Serpent Mound has, as we have shown, parallels in the rock art of the mid-continent and in the effigy mounds of the upper Midwest, which also date to this general period. It was indeed, as Ephraim Squire suggested in 1860, the recognized symbol of some grand mythological idea. This grand mythological idea is consistent with Degea Siouan creation stories, and the Degean Sioux trace their ancestry to the Ohio Valley. Some of these stories may not be unique to the Degea Sioux, however. There may have been related stories told by a variety of indigenous nations whose traditions are not so well preserved. So Proto-Shawnee groups may have been responsible for many of the Ohio petroglyphs and effigy mounds, as Swager suggested. The geographic extent of these motifs, however, suggests that the stories they tell were widespread among the peoples of the eastern woodlands, so determining the cultural identity of the creators of particular effigy mounds and rock art will require more study. But we argue that the overall cultural context for all of the sites that share the iconography we've discussed is now well established as, depending on the region, late woodland, late pre-contact, or Mississippian. All of which supports the conclusion that Serpent Mound represents a fusion of Mississippian ideology and artistic styles, upper Midwestern late woodland modes of telling sacred stories with effigy mounds, and local Fort Ancient cultural traditions. At least that's what we propose as the least wrong version of events for the time being. Thank you very much, and thanks especially to Linda Pansing and Brent Eberhard for their help in compiling information about Ohio petroglyphs.
All right, who's next?
And so the best way for her then to forward is,
I mean, you've got options. You've got the clicker, you've got
Okay.
the mouse, you've got left and right arrows,
All right.
you've got the...
welcome, so just a pointer, you can move it with the clicker,
Okay.
with this or the button.
In
All
theory.
right, in theory. Cool. We're being flexible. All right, thank you so much, Brad. Next up, we have Megan Schaefer talking about community on the fringes, updates on recent developments. Thank you very much.
Do I have to stand here for the?
Just kind of in the general, yeah.
Oh, that's okay.
If
No,
you want
I'm
to move
just-
around, and
I
I'll
won't,
set the
I won't
timer.
wander around.
You're just a tiny little box on the live stream, so
Okay.
don't worry about it too much.
And don't worry if, I don't want him to miss out on the moneymaker here, though. Don't worry if the technology fails, I can do this in interpretive dance.
You'll be fine. I think we've got it down.
So this presentation is an update on a presentation that I gave in 2020. If you remember back to 2020, it was a million years ago, about archaeology that's been done at a site called the Prather site, which is a site owned by Black property owners in part of a small integrated neighborhood that's called Wheelock-Cuyahoga Acres. This neighborhood existed in the mid-20th century between the cities of Akron and Cuyahoga Falls. Okay, so this is its location in Ohio and in Summit County, for those of you who aren't as familiar with northeastern Ohio. The reason that I wanted to present about this is because it kind of falls into a larger body of research questions that I think we're all seeing now in archaeology, certainly, about African American and Black property ownership and land uses. And it's also falling within a larger research agenda in park districts, which is where I'm from, Summit Metro Parks, that's where I work, which is about Black leisure and recreation, as well as land use questions. So it's kind of a coming together of these two kind of research agendas. So it's in Summit County, and it's within the entirety of the neighborhood falls within Summit Metro Parks, again, the organization that I work for, within Cascade Valley Metro Park, in two areas of Cascade Valley Metro Park. All of the area, you can't see it that well, but all the area that is outlined in yellow is Cascade Valley Metro Park. The outlined area in red is the Valley View area of Cascade Valley Metro Park, which is an area that Summit Metro Parks purchased in 2016. And that purchase of Valley View put the entire neighborhood within Summit Metro Parks property lines. Okay, so this is showing you, again, the Valley View area is in this kind of green outlined area in the south, and the area that's above it, outlined in yellow, is Cascade Valley Metro Parks. And then what you're seeing that is a red dotted line is the road, the access road that went through this little neighborhood. This road was called Honeywell Drive, and it is along this road that there were lots sold and houses built in the mid-20th century by both Black and white homeowners. And it was advertised as being available to Black or white property buyers. And this started in the, it was advertised from the late 1940s in this way. So we're seeing this neighborhood emerge in the late 1940s, and it really kind of hits its peak in the late 1950s, early 1960s. But it's never a really successful neighborhood. At any one time, there were probably maybe a dozen people who were living out in this area at most. We'll talk about why that was in a little bit here, but the neighborhood is being subjected to a couple of pressures from the south and from the north, almost from its inception. So from the south, if you can read this, in 1958, there is a 9-hole golf club that opens just south of the neighborhood, and this is actually the property that Summit Metro Parks bought in 2016, so it existed from the late 50s all the way up through the 2010s. And in the same, around the same time period, there's a wealthy businessman who is buying lots in Wheelock-Cuyahoga Acres, and eventually he sells those lots in the 1960s to the Akron Metropolitan Park District, which is the precursor to my organization. In the 1970s is the real death knell for the neighborhood, when the largest and most accessible house, which is the Prather home, burns down. It is destroyed by arson in the mid-1970s. Another reason that it's never, it never really takes off as a neighborhood, that it doesn't have really consistent occupation, is that the conditions aren't great. The Honeywell Drive, the main access throughway, is not maintained by the city. And it is in an area that is very steep. It's not going to be easy to access, to maintain during especially winter months, especially during wet periods. This quote is from someone who was interviewed in 2010, who had lived in the neighborhood, who'd grown up in it. I was raised in a one-room tar paper shack down there. We had no running water, no electricity or nothing for years. And this is a picture of what the road looked like in the 1950s. It is also, the main throughway which is called Cuyahoga Street, that leads to Honeywell Drive. Its passage to Akron in the south is through two redlined areas. And if you got up close to this map, you could see there's also a sewage disposal area. And the area that is outlined in blue, the little circle, is a landfill that's operating in this area too. So it really is this like between land area where the land use is kind of being used for things that you don't want in your nicer urban or suburban areas. So in 2017, we investigated the most accessible home site in this area, which was the Prather home, and that's outlined in blue here. We did work in 2017 to locate the home site, and then in 2018, we actually found the foundation, of course, as always is the case, on the last day of field school when you're supposed to be cleaning everything up, we found the foundation. So we found the foundation. We had used this site for field schools for a couple of years. We moved to a different research area. But all of this kind of came back in 2022 when the director of my park system gave a presentation at the Akron Roundtable where she used this slide. And it just so happened that someone in the audience looked at that slide and said, I know those people, and came up and contacted us after the presentation. And actually, she looked at one of the addresses on here is her address. She still lives in the family home. So that was another reason she was like, why is my address on the screen? So she came and talked to us, and this really opened up a new chapter in research for this area. And that's really the update that I wanted to talk about today. Talking with the family gave us so much more information about this neighborhood and about the people that live there. In talking with the family, we learned that George Conrad, who went by Conrad, and Willie Mae Prather were motivated to build in this area because Conrad's family was from Talladega, Alabama. They had lived as a family community on land that the family owned, and they had a self-sufficient kind of enclave there. The family that lived there were all of Conrad's aunts and uncles, as well as his parents and grandparents. Conrad was the oldest boy, and he was the only boy in his family. Like many people, he moved to the Akron area, moved to the Northeast Ohio area to Akron to work in the rubber industries, in these booming industries in the mid-1900s. He also wanted to build his own self-sufficient community for himself and for his younger sisters. He was one of 7 children, and some of his sisters did come up here with him. He joined a local church congregation, and he was a talented musician, so he actually played the organ for the church and lived on church property with Willie Mae Prather for a little while. He convinced other members of the church to join him in his endeavor, invited them to be part of this self-sufficient community with him. So this was a missing piece of the puzzle that we were trying to get a glimpse of through the archaeological work. But it's a real social piece of the puzzle that we got once we were able to talk with members of the family who were able to kind of fill in these blanks and provide this extra information. We also learned things that helped us understand the archaeology that we had done in the area much better. We learned that George and Willie Mae were slowly building their home for themselves when money allowed them to purchase materials and when time allowed them to progress. So they never actually lived in the home full time. That was one of the big things that we learned because they were constantly building it. And it explained the great myriad construction materials that we found on the site. And we had wondered if these were something that had occurred after the fire at the golf course, dumped things in this area, what was going on here. But what we learned is that it's very possible that these are all connected to the actual construction of the house. We also learned that other members of the family were living on Cuyahoga Street, which is that north-south through line that leads into Akron in the south. And other members of the family, as well as the neighbors that lived in both Wheelock Cuyahoga Acres and along Cuyahoga Street, they gardened and had fruit trees and they raised animals. And they had this kind of informal economy where they were trading labor and foodstuffs. And we had thought that we had found evidence of this in the archaeology in 2017. Actually, we uncovered this guy. This is the jawbone, the jaw and some teeth from a juvenile domestic pig found in association with other household items. So in other words, it's a shoat. We also found this little ad that was for the home that this man lived in, which was a nearby, which was one of the neighbors of the Prather. So this is found at the Prather site, and we find evidence that their neighbors are actually raising pigs and selling young juvenile and domestic pigs. They're putting them up for sale. And then we get this other information from the family that says that this was common practice, that they were trading foodstuffs, that if you grew something and someone else grew something different, that you were offering your labor to help with all of this, and you were trading those things to have a greater variety of things, to have a greater variety of foodstuffs. So we thought we had found this in the archaeological record, but the discussion with the family members tells us that this may have been representative, what we found may be representative of this more intentional informal economy that's operating throughout this community than we had realized. The new information also revitalized our work in the area, and in 2022 we went back out to Honeywell Drive to look for other structures that had been along this drive. So moving away from that southern area and up through the northern area. Working with citizen science volunteers from our park system, we did a visual survey of the entire neighborhood area and mapped in all of the extant foundations, as well as any other features of interest. We conducted limited surface collection in areas around the structures, and this helped us locate a couple of what we think are household middens. So those are things that we can also come back to in the future. We also mapped in a lot of access drives and utility poles, so not just the house foundations or structure foundations, but it's just the structure foundations that you're seeing on here. So I think in total now we have 15 structures that are related, we think are related to the neighborhood. And the most exciting part of this research is really seeing it actually materialize in the interpretation and the landmarks of the new park area. Although it doesn't look like it did when the Prathers lived here, and it doesn't look like it did when the golf course was here, and I do so many tours with people who go, I used to golf here. It doesn't look anything like that now. It doesn't look anything like that, but the Prathers and the people who lived along Honeywell Drive will be memorialized in the new park system. If you can read this at the bottom, the future trails, potential future trails, says Honeywell Link and Prather Path. So it's a way that we're trying to integrate that history into our park system. And for the future, we're hoping to reach out to more individuals who lived in this area, and now we finally have a line on some other people that live there. And our research questions will be able to incorporate what we've learned by talking to the people who are relatives of people who lived out here. So we're now asking things like, can we see social boundaries in this community through the archaeological work? Can we see representations of that informal economy? Can we understand the construction process undertaken here, as we know that people were largely building their own homes in this area? Can we understand the sequences of construction and occupation in the neighborhood? And also thinking about this more broadly, we're looking at what this can tell us about the relationship of this community to Black histories, to Black stories in our area, in terms of recreation, in terms of social connections, in terms of residential patterns. So we're really trying to see how this fits into a broader set of research questions being asked not only in archaeology and in history, but that other park districts are asking as well. And we're really trying to, this is an opportunity to make research something tangible for people. You know, even more than, I know we all love interpretive science, but even more than interpretive science. So that's it from me.
Thank you. We're actually, believe it or not, running a moment ahead. So why don't we take a moment and hopefully use the restroom, and we'll go ahead and let Kara get set up.
Do we have time for any questions of the previous speaker?
Yeah, we can also do that. So we'll start our next paper back up at 10:35, so we have about 8 minutes, 8 to 10 minutes. Yeah.
Brad.
Running early.
That's good. That means I get to catch up on things.
Oh, yeah.
My shrug.
This is you, right? Perfect. We've got presenter view up here for you. Pretty much any button will get you there. This one, this one, this one, that, or even. Yep.
Yeah, so take just a moment. We'll
I can readjust the camera if you're gonna stand here.
actually, mine's standing here.
Okay.
Trying to think where I can flop.
Well,
Yeah, so we can set this up and adjust it any moment. I don't want to be seen. Yeah, I know. Stand like right outside the view. That's what I was hoping. I was like, I'll be too tall. No one will see me. This is perfect. So we'll give it. We're early. People. I know, right? That's great. I hope I'm not the one who messes. No, you'll be totally fine. No, in fact, we're fine. So we'll give it. We'll start right in at 10:30. Perfect. So you have a moment to. How much time is it?
I appreciate the
10 minutes. Okay, great. Yeah. So take a moment. Yeah, exactly.
Now it's my field season.
For those on the live stream, we'll be back here in 10 minutes. I took myself off. I just been kind of checking in and out, so yeah, that's really good.
And I found out
Sure, you know, I'll pop up here right before we start back up and I'll say that. Yes, here again. Absolutely.
money laundering operation, which my grandfather was part of.
Yeah, great.
He was the instrumental person for the whole thing, selling, buying the island and selling it, putting it together for the Lombardo Brothers construction company in Canton, which still exists. And there were heavy duty people, which are people in the area that were involved at the time.
Yeah, so we talked about how we're an organization, I don't think have the capacity, but
So, they had a personal dilemma as to should I have them published after I'm dead or.
that's to be like a 2 days, Friday, Saturday, it's been a while since
Because I asked the Lombardo brothers who is mine.
all right.
They didn't like
But yeah, so they were looking.
the spring.
Yeah, I mean, I said it back in
So yeah, they were just reaching out to us.
I think at the very least we can help connect somebody and maybe a sponsor session or, you know. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we can do that. So then, yeah, it's in October, that actually could work out really nicely. I'll be here. Yeah, there'll be somebody else's.
I don't know what we
Do you send me the email? Maybe not. Yeah, he's super nice at this.
No, not really. I've been so many verses.
Perfect, thank you so much.
We could take like, online,
1960, they were caught. They were not caught with Johnson's time. They weren't caught with that. Yeah, so, our friend is the part of college. They were on the island. This is
tried to get the tribes out.
So I see that chapter somewhere around two my cousin said, I saw her in 2010. I did not.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. I made an announcement when I stood up there too, just acting.
Right, but I don't know.
Yeah, so, yeah, 10:35, so we'll give it a minute. I believe we're running ahead. That's amazing. Like, I did put the fear of God in people, and I was very clear. But I think, that's why I did it 20 minutes to them, and I started scheduling 25 in case of any technical problems or needed that little bit of time, because I just didn't want to have this run a whole lot over noon so that we can time everything else out. Because it was when we were at the metro park. That's always work. I try. And maybe right when we're done, if you want to just maybe pull up the map or something just to show really quick on the screen as we're wrapping up after, maybe both after this meeting and the business meeting, right? Because there may be people here who aren't ready for it. Would they be allowed to see? Well, we can, I think, mention it both times that you can. Well, I mean, I said, but they sit here, but they can't. Oh, Erica just texted me. Here, live stream. She emailed me. Oh, everything's fine. Because I said it should be good now. She's all right. We'll give it 2 more minutes. Yeah, I'll give it shit right now. That is
Yes.
As we just have a few more minutes before we get started, I wanted to give an announcement that there are some books back here for sale that Copeland has brought if you want to take a look at them. He has some volumes back there on the table.
What's that?
They look really interesting, so I just did a peek at them.
I can hear you even standing over there with this microphone, which means I'm probably coming in crystal clear in my talk.
Nice. You'll get all your secrets.
I'm about to hear myself in about 2 seconds here.
One more minute, and then we'll get started. There's some coffee back there. It's nice and warm, and this room is a little chilly. I don't think cold. They use cold left.
It's nice though, keeps you awake.
Right. I mean, we're not like sneezing. Maybe just since we're here, we can go ahead and get started. That way we keep on
Hold on,
track.
can I adjust the camera?
Yeah, adjust the camera, and I'll come up and I'll introduce you.
Oh,
So.
sorry.
Oh, and while we're adjusting it,
Oh,
just
you
so
can-
we make sure I get the pronunciation right. I was right, but it's one. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the live stream. I appreciate the quick break we just took. Next up, we have Tara Cassano talking about human perseverance, a case study of 2 rare dislocations. Thank you very much. I'll set the timer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tara Rose Cassano, and I am the osteology lab supervisor for IR Lab. And today I will be talking about one of the individuals that we have excavated from the Harrison Township Cholera Cemetery. Please be advised that this presentation contains images of human skeletal remains from the 19th century. These are not native ancestors, but it's still important. If you do wish to leave the room at this time or turn off your screen, please feel free to do so.
Thank you.
I would like to start by acknowledging that the land that I'm giving this presentation on is the ancestral and contemporary territory of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandot, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples. I want to acknowledge that the forced removal of these nations from their ancestral lands and the ongoing systemic effects of this displacement. So, Harrison Township Cholera Cemetery. This cemetery is located in Pickaway County in central Ohio. It was a family and community burial ground used from 1804 to 1859. It is also believed to be the burial ground of individuals that died from the cholera outbreaks of 1833 and 1849. Unfortunately, there has been significant vandalism to the cemetery and our scarce archival information about who is buried there, so many of these individuals are completely unknown. Individual 6085 is one of these unknown individuals. They are an adult male, estimated to be at least 35 years of age. What makes this individual so unique is that they exhibit 2 rare dislocations: the dislocation of the temporal mandibular joint and the right knee. As you can see in this picture, the right knee has been severely dislocated and fused at a nearly 90-degree angle. So you can see right there. I didn't place the bone like that. It is fused in that position. In fact, when you view the right femur from the front, it actually looks like this individual is a lower leg amputee. That is how severe the angle is. The skeletal elements involved in the fusion are the distal end of the femur, the proximal end of the tibia, and the patella. The fibula was not noticeably impacted and remains unfused. So here are several more views of the femur. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This picture is not edited. This is the femur sitting upright, viewed from the front. As you can see, the lower leg disappears completely behind it. The tibia is still in alignment with the distal end of the femur, but is slightly twisted laterally. The patella has been completely displaced laterally. It is evident from the fusion of this joint at this angle and the positions of the skeletal elements that several ligaments were torn and the injury was never successfully set. In this day and age, if you suffered an injury such as this, you would likely have your leg reset into a normal position and then stabilized for a long period of time to allow the ligaments and bones to heal properly. This did not happen with this individual. The severity of the dislocation and evidence of a healed bone infection are indicative of a traumatic event. The epiphyses of the tibia and the femur were fully fused when the injury was sustained, indicating that it occurred when the individual had reached at least 20 years of age. The appearance of the callus and healed osteomyelitis indicate that the injury had fully healed by the time of death. So it's a little difficult to see, but this right here, this little hole, is actually something called a cloaca, which is a product of a bone infection. And what that is a drainage hole for pus. Because it is completely smooth, it indicates to me that this infection is no longer active. And you can see here too, just to let you know what you're looking at, this is the base of the femur is shooting up that way, this is the patella, and this is the tibia. There is also significant evidence for the bilateral, chronic, recurrent dislocation of the temporomandibular joints. That is to say, the repetitive dislocation of the lower jaw. This was determined by the presence of pseudofacets on both temporal bones. Facets are the small, smooth surfaces of bone where articulation occurs. Pseudofacets are exactly as they sound, they are fake facets. These are created when the joint is repeatedly out of normal articulation. The presence of pseudofacets directly in front of the mandibular foci indicates the chronic nature of this dislocation. In these photos here, you can see normal articulation of the mandible with the cranium, and this picture shows the greatest extent of the dislocation. You can see how far the jaw is actually jutting out underneath of the cranium. Though dislocation occurred on both sides of the jaw, the pseudofacet on the right was more pronounced, indicating the dislocation was not consistently symmetrical. It appears that often one mandibular condyle would be completely dislocated while the other would be partially or not dislocated at all. So here, this is the mandibular fossa. So this is normally where the mandible sits. This is the fake facet I was telling you about that formed from this repetitive dislocation. You'll notice there's also some pitting on that surface, which again indicates repetitive use of that surface. And then this picture here is to show you I've placed the mandible where it would have actually dislocated to. So the mandible, the mandibular condyle here, should be resting in this fossa, but it is significantly farther forward on that false facet. So the TMJ is under neuromuscular control. Dislocation of the joint can be caused by a mechanical muscle issue or disparity in neuromuscular function. Symptoms of TMJ dislocation as observed clinically include drooling, speech difficulties, the inability to close your lips or your mouth completely, and one side effect of excessive drooling is saliva aspiration, which can lead to an increased chance of respiratory infections. In fact, this individual shows evidence of an active middle and upper respiratory infection, and the plaques of bone on the ribs are so thick and layered that it is apparent that this individual either suffered multiple repetitive respiratory infections or a long-term chronic respiratory infection. Another indication of the TMJ dislocation is the wear pattern of the dentition. As you can see, the anterior, the front teeth of this individual are extremely worn. This is very unusual, especially for an individual who is likely no more than 45 or 50 years of age. As you can see, it is also focused right on the anterior teeth. this was caused by that chronic misalignment of the jaw. So if you imagine the teeth are rubbing back and forth, the jaw is sliding out left to right continually. And it's actually worn the teeth so that the bottom teeth slope back and the upper teeth slope forward. So this is another clear indication of this dislocation. So this is my favorite part. One of the most remarkable skeletal changes related to the dislocation of the knee occurred in the right foot. Pseudofacets, again, those fake facets, have formed on the distal end of the 1st through 4th metatarsals of the right foot, symptomatic of weight-bearing, repetitive hyperdorsiflexion of the toes. Here I am showing you both of the navicular, which is a small bone from the foot and the ankle. As you can see, this is the left navicular, so from the uninjured leg. This is the right navicular from the injured leg. This is one of my most remarkable finds on this individual because I was able to find evidence of what causes this significant change in examples from Chinese foot binding. So as you can see, this is from a paper on Chinese foot binding. This is a normal navicular, just like the one on the left, and this is an abnormal navicular that has gone through the exact same morphological changes as the one found in this individual. Now, this is important because this tuberosity right here, the tuberosity of the navicular, is the insertion site for the tibialis posterior, which is a muscle that is extremely important in supporting the lower leg and the stability of the lower leg. So I want you to picture a ballerina in demi-pointe. It appears that due to the angle at which the knee was fused, the individual was propelling themselves by walking in a partially crouched, deep lunge-like position, bearing their weight on a cane or similar object on their left side. In order to cause such significant changes to the bone, the individual must have been walking in this position on a regular basis. Now, I know nobody else is going to be able to see this, and I'm going to look a little bit ridiculous, but in order to demonstrate for you, you have to imagine that the right leg is fused at that 90-degree angle. It is not moving. So in order for this person to bear weight on their right-hand foot, they had to walk in a lunge like this, supporting themselves on the left side with a cane or other form of mobility device. And again, as I said, in order for these changes to be so substantial, they must have been doing this quite regularly. Now, the effects of these rare dislocations are systemic. These images here are of the pelvis of this individual and the sacrum. As you can see, there is abnormal bone degradation and newborn bone formation on the auricular surface of both the os coxa and the sacrum. It is likely that these changes occurred from the forced position, sleeping position of this individual. Again, this leg is not moving. It is at that 90-degree angle at all times. If you saw earlier in the presentation when I showed the individual in situ, you could see how the right leg was crossed underneath the left. So you can imagine this is the normal sleeping position. Now, if you do this yourself, you'll feel your hip actually turn out and be stuck in this position. This is not a normal position for the hip to remain in for extended periods of time. So this repetitive stress and change, and also likely that walking position that I just described, caused these changes. Now, this change is so severe. This is the sacrum. This is the pelvis, the os coxa. You can see that early fusion is actually taking place. It's in those early stages preceding fusion. So you can imagine the sacroiliac joint grinding against itself. There is very little mobility. I know it doesn't feel like you have a ton of mobility in that joint. There's not much you feel like you can do with it, but I promise if it's not functioning properly, you're going to notice. The last skeletal change I'd like to talk about is here on the sacrum. These are the clavicular facets, again, those smooth articulations This is where the clavicle articulates with the scapula on the acromion process. Both of these facets are extremely pronounced. When I even first pulled this bone out, I was remarked at the size of the facet, and then I pulled out the left one and said, okay, well, that's even bigger. It's definitely something I've never seen before. And what this may indicate to us is that the individual likely bore their weight on crutches or some other form of bilateral support during the healing process of the leg, so before they could bear any weight on the leg. And then, because the left continued to become more pronounced and is significantly larger than the right, that would indicate to me that they possibly transitioned to a single mobility device used on the left-hand side. Again, reminding ourselves of the position I demonstrated earlier and the need to support on the strong side of the body, which would have been the left. So that single mobility device would have allowed them to walk in that crouched-like position with some semblance of support. Now, the question everyone wants to know when we do a presentation on bones, what's the cause? How do you know exactly what happened? Is it an accident? Is it a disorder? Well, unfortunately, to be the bearer of bad news, as usual in most osteological case studies, it's difficult to ascertain the specific causes of these rare dislocations. One possibility is that both the initial TMJ dislocation and the knee dislocation were part of a single traumatic event. One example could be falling off of a horse and having your foot stuck in the stirrup and being dragged. As I mentioned earlier, the TMJ can have dislocation based on a muscular issue. So if there had been a traumatic accident that had caused that initial problem, it could have continued in the future. Now, the other possibility is simply that this individual was more susceptible to dislocation due to systemic ligamentous or muscular laxity. That is to say, a looseness in the muscles or ligaments. These are caused by conditions such as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and Marfan syndrome. But again, there's no concrete evidence to confirm or deny either scenario, so the exact cause will have to be left to speculation. Thank you.
That was really great, and it makes my hip hurt thinking about it. As someone who has experienced problem with the sacrum and the hip.
Is it?
Andrew Tremaine.
That one, yeah.
Yes. All right. Next up today, we have Andrew Tremaine et al. We'll be talking about current research and management of Black history sites on the Wayne National Forest in Southeast Ohio. So you can move the slides with this or with this, and the green is your pointer. And you should be good to go. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, hello everyone. Good morning. Thank you to the Ohio Archaeology Council for the invitation to come speak to you all today. My name is Andrew Tremaine, and I'm the Heritage Program Manager for the Wayne National Forest. Today I'm going to present to you the results of some of our recent investigations into Black historical sites on the Wayne National Forest. Before I dive into this, I want to acknowledge the contributions of my co-authors, Drs. Jason Herman, Corey Crawford, Joseph Gingrich, and Nancy Tatarek from the University of Pennsylvania and from Ohio University. The focus of my presentation today will be really on two 19th century free Black settlements in Ohio, one known as Poke Patch and the other Payne's Crossing. And Payne's Crossing really will be the primary focus since we recently completed some renewed investigations using remote sensing and some new archival research that Dr. Tatarak has been working on. So to get everybody oriented, Wayne National Forest is in southeast Ohio. It's comprised of 3 management areas. The Athens District, which has the Athens and Marietta units to the north, and the Ironton District located down to the south. This is Ironton, Marietta, Athens. The proclamation boundary is like 800,000 acres, but the Wayne National Forest, the U.S. Forest Service, actually owns and manages a patchwork of about 248,000 acres of land. And this means that the Wayne National Forest is really interspersed with state lands, small towns, private property. So there's a ton of interest. I'm flying along here on accident. So the locations of the Black history sites that I'm going to be talking about are really up here in the north and to the south. Poke Patch is the first one that I'm going to speak to you about. I'm sure many of you are aware that Ohio was a free state for black people prior to the Civil War. And as such, black people fleeing bondage and slavery in the South often passed through Ohio in their attempt to reach freedom, often as far north to Canada. But free black settlements and sympathetic abolitionist whites often provided the safe harbor, a network of safe houses and trails that's really come to be known as the Underground Railroad, crisscrosses southeast Ohio. And one of those sites actually is, it passes right through Poke Patch, located in kind of the boundary of Lawrence and Gallia County. Poke Patch was founded by free blacks in the 1820s. People in this community were primarily farmers and also workers at the iron furnaces. Residents established log church in 1819 in the nearby town of Black Fork, and this structure was replaced in 1879, which is still there and in use today. I believe it's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, Black Baptist church in the region. Some researchers have come to believe Poke Patch was settled specifically to be a way station for the Underground Railroad. How do you get this thing just to scroll down so I could read continue my notes right there?
You can scroll either with down here.
Okay, I wasn't sure if the mouse
that'll
was
take
gonna
it.
let me.
Yeah, it's going to move you forward in slides as well.
So you can't really look at that. All right, I'm going to go back to this. Sorry.
That's okay.
Well, I mean, the main note about Poke Patch is that this settlement it's a rural landscape, and there's not a lot of archaeological structures or remains that we're aware of. So we look at it more as a designated area where we know something important happened, but there's not a lot of physical remains that we can point to, which is one reason why I put the church up there. We're aware of a cemetery also at the church, and we've found some evidence of other small, likely historic cemeteries related to this, but they're unmarked graves and nothing that we can really, highlight and interpret and put signs by or anything to say like, hey, this is where these people lived and here's the evidence for that. So there's ongoing kind of survey work and interest in finding evidence for that. Now, one thing we can point to are the furnaces, because we know the people that lived in Poke Patch were part of this industry, the main workers. So Cambria and Gallia furnaces are very nearby to the community of Poke Patch. We know that these iron furnaces were built and owned by wealthy white abolitionists, including John Campbell, who's the founder of the town of Ironton, Ohio. And as such, it is believed that many of the furnaces were also used to help those fleeing bondage and to escape to freedom. And we think that some of the folks that were escaping through the Underground Railroad network, they would be conducted into Poke Patch, where they could even work in the furnace industry to get some money to move along. So, yeah, like I said, they've come to believe that the town was even created specifically to be part of the Underground Railroad. So there's a lot of work that we need to do to start to really understand the archaeological record here and make the links within that community to the historical story. Now I'm going to turn my attention to the north, to Payne's Crossing. Now, Wilbert Siebert's Trails book doesn't put Payne's Crossing on his map as being part of the Underground Railroad. But this was a free black settlement, Payne's Crossing. Research conducted by my predecessor, Ann Kramer, who maybe many of you know. She put a lot of time into this with her colleagues and found that the people that settled Payne's Crossing were well connected with abolitionists from the Marietta area. And so it's more than likely that they also were a stop along the Underground Railroad. So Payne's Crossing is located on the border of Hocking and Perry counties, about 2 miles southwest of the little town of New Straitsville. The community and cemetery were basically abandoned and forgotten during the early part of the 20th century. But in the 1990s, the U.S. Forest Service, with the help of Lancaster Genealogical Society and other volunteers in the community and family members, descendants of Payne's Crossing area, they relocated the cemetery. It was State Route 595 runs right past it on the way to New Straitsville, but it was completely overgrown by the forest, and they worked to clear the cemetery and restore the headstones, and there's been ongoing work over the past 2 decades to, now you go there and there's historical markers and a lawn, and it's really well maintained and looks great. So Payne's Crossing was a series of homesteads rather than just like a town with a downtown and stuff. It was more farms and really pretty rural outside of New Straitsville. It is believed to have been settled starting in the 1820s, 1830s, and occupied all the way up to the 1920s. The founders came from North Carolina and Virginia, among other states. It's long been told that it was, like I had mentioned, a stop on the Underground Railroad. So the earliest settlers were not the Payne family, which it's named after, but the Norman families, Stevens, Letts, and Harpers, all of whom were there in the 30s and early 40s. We know from the cemetery itself that some of the individuals, including 2 Payne men, fought in the Civil War. And so we have veterans from the U.S. colored troops regiments that are buried at the cemetery. As indicated here is one of the, today they're all marked by flags, and it's pretty nice. So to understand the site and the cemetery and how they appear in the archaeological record as they do today, it helps obviously to understand the land use history, so of course we look to the old maps and atlases and historic photos to help us tell that story and look for clues about what structures might be there and ways to help interpret the record that we see. And this is from 1875 approximately, I believe, and you can see that the Paynes do own the land. The cemetery is indicated at that time. There's 2 house structures are indicated at that time. The Cooper shop and school I've looked all over for, and we don't seem to have any evidence for that, and it may become clear in a minute why we're not seeing that. The 1907 map also clearly shows two structures in the cemetery. The road running by the Cooper Shop and School don't show up in 1907 anymore. So, and then we've got aerial photography starting as early as the 1930s that show this area is clear cut of trees, and there's quite a lot of roads. Sorry, I'm trying to hit the laser and jumping ahead. But, you know, it gives us some clues about how the settlements themselves were impacted through time and some reasons why things look like they do. And I should have been forward thinking and put a visual aerial of what it looks like today, because it's forest. It's completely overgrown, and maybe we can see some of that in the other pictures. But we all gathered there earlier this spring with students and professors from University of Pennsylvania, the Museum of Archaeology. Jason Herman is an expert in geophysics and all that instrumentation. He brought students with him, and then we had students with Drs. Joe Gingrich and Corey Crawford, archaeologists at Ohio University, and their archaeology students. And we use this as an opportunity to do some exploratory work using these non-invasive techniques, but to also like introduce the students to this. So it was kind of a win-win in getting this information, but providing opportunities to the younger students. So the methods employed included ground penetrating radar, aerial photography. Jason Herman flew a drone up over and took pictures, aerial photos of the cemetery. They had GNSS, high resolution GPS, to collect data points, electrical resistivity, and magnetic gradiometry. So we used the GPR at the cemetery, and then the other two methods at the farmstead located nearby. So benefits of using these, it's non-destructive. It's a fairly rapid methodology for collecting information, and it's easily repeatable. As long as you've got somebody that has the expertise and the instrumentation. Of course, it's not easy for just everybody to get a hold of a ground penetrating radar and go collect the data. So you need somebody like Dr. Herman that knows what they're seeing and looking at, So just to get everybody oriented again, you saw those earlier maps. The cemetery's up here and the farmstead is down the hill next to what now is like a big strip mine pond, which wasn't there in those earlier pictures. And you can see the pine tree stands and forest. So we broke into teams while we were out there for the 2 days with students collecting GPR data at the cemetery and others collecting the ER and MAG data down at the settlement at the farmstead. The image on the left is what Dr. Herman presented as a model showing expectations for what a grave shaft should look like in the data sets that when they're collecting the data. So just to be clear, they did transects across the entire cemetery back and forth, so like pretty much 100% coverage, and then use the GPS to be able to tie in those data sets of where they're collecting the data. So then, take a look again just at what the expectations are for what grave shafts look like. And this is a slice of some of the actual data that he produced, which just, this should not be a surprise. We're at a cemetery with headstones. But what is nice to see is the confirmation of the technology working so well. But also, this brings us to the question, of course, that I have as a manager, and maybe if you're interested in understanding more about the cemetery, are there unmarked graves? What's the real history of the use of the cemetery, and what are the real boundaries of the cemetery? Are there areas that we need to expand our protection zone? So the way this works, to process the maps, they create these maps, and then, this is all the stuff that Dr. Herman does, and it's not my expertise, but basically they can create these time slices, which ultimately will allow them to create a plan view map, from different depths within there. So he could, with the right, software, you can create 3D models that you can fly through and look at all this stuff. The red on here are the areas that, have a higher, I would just put it in simple words, that's more likely where there's been digging going on and ground disturbance. All those little black dots on there are the headstones. So you can see that there's a correlation often with the headstones and with where the graves are. But some of the headstones were found in the forest and put back in there, and they're not necessarily in the right spot. And there's areas where there was a lot of digging and there's no headstone. So, and you can see this continues, it matches up pretty well to the deeper levels, indicating that this isn't just shallow disturbances, but they're digging down pretty deep. So for me, that kind of brings us to this map, which I wanted, which is like, where are all those unmarked graves? And it's kind of color coded here, but the darker the pink, the higher probability that is a grave shaft. And we can see that there's a number of likely unmarked graves throughout the cemetery. And this area down here, again, I'm jumping through slides as I hit the laser, sorry, is really of interest as the road goes right by here, and we would obviously want to make sure that highway doesn't encroach upon those boundaries, but we also wonder, the forest is down here, and it kind of looks like it might continue into the forest, and so, we maybe, with more time, can expand the search using this technology beyond these boundaries. So, down below at the farmstead, the students spent some time using electrical resistance equipment in one part of the site. It's basically a good technique for identifying buried walls, ditches, compressed soils, roads, compacted grounds. It sends electrical current into the ground and just sends the signal back. So that's how it detects these things. Now, because we were training the students, we didn't get very far with the coverage. We laid out a 30 by 30 meter grid, and there were data gaps, and I would have to have Dr. Herman here to explain what he saw, so I didn't even put that slide in there. Just letting you guys know that we use this technique. I think it wasn't quite as effective for us as when Dr. Herman just got his magnetic gradiometry equipment out and took it on himself, and he was able to survey the whole 30 by 30 meter square. Now, magnetic gradiometry, as maybe many of you are familiar with, this one is, detecting the magnetic anomalies that are out there, and it's really good for finding like disturbed soils, burning, fired materials like fire-cracked rock and bricks, and of course metal objects, iron, whatever. It's going to pick that up and it creates an anomaly. So then you can see from the results here that there's quite a bit of stuff that we detected. First off, we got we got fence lines, and you could see some of the metal from the fence lines still attached to trees that are down there. You've got an activity area. He had noted there was a depression that was just loaded full of stuff, and so obviously that created a huge anomaly. And then what Dr. Herman was interpreting as a possible foundation. We placed our grid kind of in an area that was just a clearing of the forest next to a definite foundation and wells. So we didn't really feel like there was a need to bust over all this stuff. But I got a couple minutes. So, yeah, I think the results of that preliminary work were pretty intriguing, and I would love to continue with this kind of work, expanding our survey area to see what we can find in other parts of the farmstead. And you may recall, I mentioned there was like that other settlement, that other house further to the west. We did some on-foot survey down there and did locate that foundation, so it could be another good location to bring in the magnetometry equipment and maybe the GPR if we can get those guys back out here. So now I'm just going to take the last part of my presentation to talk about the work that Dr. Nancy Tatarak has been doing. You can do the archaeological research, but in this time period we can also do archival research, and this is a way to bring the story to life, and make connections to the real people that were living there. As I had mentioned, my predecessor, Ann Kramer, completed a great deal of research into the history of Payne's Crossing. She worked closely with descendant family members to put together the genealogies and research the deeds and historical records. And Nancy, Dr. Tatarak, has been studying birth and death records along with going through news reports. So the family had actually shared with Ann Kramer like pictures of some of the Payne family members, and it's often noted that the black people of Payne's Crossing were living with white and black people. It was very integrated. Some of the founders, I believe, were free blacks because they were freed by the people that were like their parents, in that situation. So that's not to imply that they always note too that the people at Payne's Crossing, for being black, they seem to be rather wealthy based on the things they owned, the records, and but that's not to say that there was not still some discrimination. One story that Nancy had talked about shows up from an old newspaper clipping that she got concerning one individual buried at the cemetery by the name of Rosanna Nixon. So this provides a little humanistic perspective for what some of the people buried at Payne Cemetery must have gone through. This newspaper clipping concerns the death of Rosanna. She was Rosanna Green, married to Granville Nixon in 1868. In 1900, the family lived in New Straitsville on Railroad Street. And I'm going to switch here so I can actually read some of this newspaper clipping to you because it is rather interesting. So Granville, he was a barber in the town, and his wife passed away in 1903, Granville passing away the following year. But the newspaper article is a telling example of how people of Payne's Crossing were treated. While it's clear that for a black woman she was very much respected in the community, the people in the area were not free from racism. To quote, "The Nixons have occupied a unique position in our town since they are colored people, and it is an unwritten law that colored people shall not settle in this town, and their residence here is but a testimonial to their character and good citizenship. They were among the earliest settlers of the town, and few people have been more respected. Her funeral was one of the largest processions that have been in our town, more than 60 carriages being in a line." And then it goes on to add that she was buried in the Colored People Cemetery 2 miles south of town. So, yeah, unfortunately, New Straitsville at that time was one of those sunset towns, but because the Payne family or the residents of Payne's Crossing had been there for so long, they seem to have been accepted and part of the community there. So just to wrap it up, many people have questions. Well, what happened to Payne's Crossing? The farmstead stayed in the family until 1930s. Westward Payne owned it, and he started leasing the property at oil gas companies in 1902. When he passed away, his daughter inherited it, and then on to the granddaughter, Florence Priest of New Straitsville. Now, Florence Priest, she leased the land to a coal company in the 1930s. And then from my reading, she told that company after they'd been mining for a couple of years that she had made an agreement with somebody else. Well, they sued her. She lost the lawsuit. Next thing you know, the property is at the sheriff's sale, which I assume has been repossessed because she couldn't pay the fees, and it was then sold to the coal company that sued her, or they got it. So in my view, it just really sounds like she was cheated out of her land. And thereafter, the heavy mining industry goes in there, and we got the roads, we got the oil and gas. And so in conclusion, there's some amazing Black history stories and sites on the Wayne National Forest. Our goals are to better understand how the archaeological record relates to the historical documentation. We want to find ways to protect and steward these sites. For example, to nominate Payne Cemetery to the National Register of Historic Places, elevate its status, and we want to interpret and share with the public these stories of underserved populations that have a contribution to our area. And we want to promote inclusivity and equality to make everyone feel welcome on our United States public lands. So that's a very important message that I want to finish with. Thanks to everybody here. Thanks to my co-authors and volunteers. And that's all.
Thank you so much. You bet.
That's right. Thank you so much. All right. And then last but not least is Robert. Thank you so much. Our final presentation of the morning is Robert Chidester talking about You Will Do Better in Toledo, Urban Archaeology in the Glass City. Let's let you come up here. There's your pointer, and those will advance the slides, as will the mouse. All right,
Thanks.
take it away.
All right, thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to be talking about a project that we did in downtown Toledo now several years ago. It was sort of your typical Section 106 consultation project. There was a local nonprofit healthcare provider who had gotten a federal grant. The federal agency told them, you have to do an environmental assessment. And of course, they had no idea what an environmental assessment was, so they hired Mannequin Smith to do it for them. And part of that was consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office. So if you're unfamiliar with Toledo, this is downtown Toledo right here. So this site was just off of downtown Toledo. Here's a closer view. Of course, being in the city, our client thought, well, what possible environmental issues could there be? I looked at these sites and said, ooh, parking lots. This is going to be fun. Of course, I was right. Our clients hate it when I'm right, but when it comes to parking lots, I tend to be right more often than not. So, of course, one of the first things we did was we looked at Sanborn fire insurance maps. They go back to the 1880s in Toledo. As you can see here, by the turn of the century, the area was it was starting to fill up with residential housing. The area along Jefferson had first been developed in the 1860s as an upper middle class neighborhood. By around 1900, it was definitely on a downward trajectory. It was sort of more of a lower middle class and working class neighborhood. By the 1930s, there were a few major changes. For one thing, there were a couple of very large apartment buildings. This is a Cadillac dealership, an automotive service center, and then there was a lot of commercial development down on the south end here. We also, of course, looked at some other records. I really like these two photographs. This, of course, is the Cadillac dealership. This is one of those two apartment buildings. From this photo of the Cadillac dealership, you can see the back end of that apartment building. From this photo of the apartment building, you can see the back end of the Cadillac dealership. Really nice juxtaposition. So we started by doing both ground penetrating radar and electromagnetometry. I really like the ground penetrating radar results because you can see right here, and right here, house foundations that almost perfectly match the Sanborn maps. I've never seen quite such stunning correspondence, but it was really clear as soon as I looked at the maps that we had some intact foundations underneath all that asphalt. So we proceeded to hire a backhoe operator. We dug 13 trenches. identified a total of 29 archaeological features underneath all that asphalt, and we didn't actually collect that many artifacts, though. There frankly weren't a whole lot of artifacts to be collected. When we did this project, I had just come off of a similar project in Detroit, where there were artifacts literally pouring out of every shovel full of backhoe dirt. Here in Toledo, not so much. But we did find, as I said, 29 features, and as you can see here, this is the asphalt surface. This asphalt was laid down in the early 1960s, literally inches below the asphalt. We had these intact house foundations. It was pretty stunning. We also found the foundation of this very large apartment building. We found a number of brick shaft features. Not quite sure, this one, I'm not sure what it was originally used for. We ended up discovering that it was used by the Cadillac dealership to dispose of their used motor oil. But we also found 2 large brick cisterns, as well as a number of utility features. I am a total nerd for historic utilities. I think they're awesome and really interesting. Most people don't. So, so our phase 1 results were quite promising. Even though the artifact deposits were relatively sparse, we did have all these in more or less intact archaeological features. Some of them appeared to have been originally built, again, in the 1860s or 1870s. Some of them were definitely more recent, mid-20th century. But our results were good enough after what we were calling a phase 1 survey that the State Historic Preservation Office determined that these resources were eligible for the National Register. So we skipped over the traditional phase 2 stage and we went right to data recovery. So in terms of planning for how we were going to get the most amount of information out of these sites, of course we prepared a research design, and these were some of the questions that we wanted to see if we could address. How did the standard of living for neighborhood residents change over time? One of the patterns that we could see on the Sanborn maps and from other sources was a trend away from single-family homes towards rooming houses and apartment buildings or flats. And so we wanted to know, was this demographic change and economic change, could we correlate that with changes in consumer behaviors, gendered patterns of behavior? Were there families living in these places, or were they mostly childless adults? What were the ethnic, racial, class patterns within this neighborhood? Also, again, going back to the utilities, very interested in looking at municipal sanitation laws, the timing of those compared to the timing of when both municipal and private utilities were extended to this neighborhood. That's something that certainly in Detroit I have discovered the actual laws on the books were trailed by quite some time in when services were extended to certain neighborhoods. We wanted to see if that was true in Toledo as well. Was there variability within the project area in when utilities were hooked up to certain buildings? But we were also interested to know, the mid-20th century is a time period that a lot of archaeologists think is too recent. Not a lot of archaeologists, we've seen a couple of presentations today that talk about this time period, but that's really sort of a recent development. Even in historical archaeology, there are a lot of archaeologists who say the 1950s, what could possibly be left from the 1950s that would be interesting from an archaeological perspective? So we wanted to know if we could find discrete deposits that would date to the middle of the 20th century. So we went about selecting 13 features of the 29 for targeted data recovery. As you can see here, all those features were sort of clustered at the northern end. This area down here, even though we had recorded some features, they were pretty well disturbed. I'm going to focus on these 3 sites. While we did investigate some features down in this area, these 3 sites were really the good ones. And again, you might notice that these are the 3 sites that showed up really well in the GPR results. So LU 843. This was a residence. It was a single-family home that was built sometime in the 1880s. It no longer, actually, if you look at, so I have 1938 here, but if you look at the 1936 Sanborn map, the house doesn't show up on that map. So it was taken down sometime in the 1930s. But we found basically the entire intact foundation, including interior walls, chambers on the back end of the house. It was complete. It was all just right there. We did recover 1,500 artifacts from this site, and it appears that when the house was torn down, a lot of stuff was left in the house and everything was just pushed into the open basement. So here's a site map showing where we dug our units. We dug one here on the outside of the structure. We did find some utility pipes running alongside the house, one inside the house here. This was an interesting chamber on the back end of the house. It had a lot of burnt soil in it, so we think maybe that's evidence that at least part of the house burned, and maybe that's why it was demolished. And then we also dug a unit here right around where the sewer line would have exited the house. So this is just a sample of some of the artifacts we found. Here's one of those utility pipes I was talking about, stoneware beer bottle, really nice glass goblet of some sort. This one's interesting. It's kind of hard to tell from this photo, but we figured out that these items, when put back together, represent a small portable gas burner. There was actually I don't think you can see it in this photo, but there was a little rubber nipple where the hose would have attached to deliver the gas to the burner. Maybe that's why the house burned down. All right, right next to it, site LU 844, again, basically an intact house foundation. You can also see this is one of those brick cisterns that I was talking about back here off the corner of the house. Again, this one was also built in the 1880s. It was not torn down until the early 1960s, right before the asphalt was laid down for the parking lot. We didn't recover as many artifacts from within the house foundation, although we did recover quite a bit from the cistern. As with 843, it appears that when this house was demolished in about 1961, that everything was just pushed into the empty basement. The utilities on this one were really interesting. I love this, this really nice example of home handyman repairs to the sewer line. There was clearly a hole in it, and they just put down some cement and topped it with a couple of bricks. That was their fix. I don't know how well that worked, but it certainly was fun to uncover. Here's an extension of that same line. For some reason, what looks to be a sewer line was going into the front of the house. I'm not quite sure why that was. Here's the cistern. This was really interesting. I'll have another photo here, but a very large brick cistern with a domed cap that was taken off by the backhoe. Again, we did find quite a few artifacts. It appears this cistern was probably decommissioned sometime in the 19-teens, which is when the city of Toledo outlawed the use of privies and cisterns. But then sometime later, probably in the later 20s and 1930s, it was used for trash disposal. But what's really interesting is that we found an interior partition within the cistern. I've never seen this before. I haven't, all the sources I've found about cistern construction, I can't quite figure out why they would have built this partition. It appears to have been a later addition, not original. The only thing I can think of is that maybe when the house transitioned from being a single-family residence to a rooming house, maybe they partitioned the cistern to give different residents different sources of water. So again, here's a site plan showing where we dug our units, and here's the location of the cistern at the rear of the house. This is a profile of the cistern showing the partition in the middle. Here's an example of some of the artifacts. We found a lot of artifacts related to electrical wiring. This is all knob and tube, which was very, very common from the 1890s to the 1930s. Nice pipe joint compound tube. An intact light bulb that was in the basement, just in a bunch of brick rubble. I don't know how the light bulb survived, but it did. This tile came from the front of the house, so it gives us some idea of how the entryway might have been decorated architecturally. A lot of various bottles, this stuff all came out of the cistern. This is a hair tonic bottle. This is a much earlier bottle. It's Dr. Green's Nervura, but it was in a deposit with a bunch of stuff from the 1930s. The bottle itself was probably from the 19th century, but somebody had apparently kept it before throwing it out in the 30s. Here's a homeopathic vial. Lots of animal bones, butchered animal bones, and a whole lot of mass-produced product bottles. All right, so 845. This is across the street. This property is really interesting. This was one of the earliest structures to be built within the neighborhood. It was probably built in the 1860s. In 1902, it was turned into a hospital. It was the 6th hospital that was available to the general public in Toledo. It was only a hospital for about 12 years. The doctor who ran the hospital died of a heart attack at the age of 50 in 1914. And after that, his widow, turned it into a rooming house, just like 844. This one here, this is actually that shaft feature that I said had all the used motor oil from the Cadillac dealership. But here you have the cistern that was associated with the house/hospital, and we also uncovered the back end of the foundation. Because of some other issues with utilities and whatnot, we weren't able to uncover the entire foundation of this house, but we did get the back of it. So again, here's the cistern. This is, again, a small room off the back of the house. The house was torn down sometime around 1950. Again, we did collect quite a few artifacts, over 700 artifacts from these two features. I apologize for this text here. Every time I make a PowerPoint at work and I bring it somewhere else to give a presentation, the text gets all screwed up. I don't know why that is. But again, lots of mass-produced product bottles. These are all condiment bottles. This bottle actually was still half full with cologne. Smelled pretty good for being as old as it was. These bottles, these are all medicinal bottles, but they all post-date the period of the hospital. Unfortunately, we didn't actually find any artifacts from the period when this house was used as a hospital. Everything that we found was either from before or from after. But then, of course, there were also some liquor bottles. Other various household items. We found a lot of very, very rusty tin cans. Unfortunately, we don't know what most of them were used for. Some footwear. This is one of my favorite artifacts. This is a roll of camera film. Unfortunately, it was too fragile for us to unroll it and see what the photos were. But this is also one of my favorite things that I have ever found. It's a Hills Brothers ground coffee tin. But when we found it, when we pulled it out of the cistern, it was stuffed full of rib bones. Somebody had had a nice rib dinner and just put all the bones in the empty coffee tin and tossed it into the old cistern. Most of the artifacts, I should say, from this cistern, we found bottles with date codes, manufacturing date codes, up to 1947. And most of this stuff appears to date to the 1940s. So it looks like with this cistern, there was just a single dumping episode right before the house was torn down. So, what did we conclude? Well, in terms of demographic change, this is mostly from the archival record. There was a definite socioeconomic decline from the 1880s to the 1930s, which we could tell from census records and city directories telling us what people's jobs were, as well as the shift from single-family homes to flats and boarding houses. It was a relatively homogeneous Euro-American population, although some Hispanic surnames did start to appear at the addresses represented by these sites in the 1940s. We found no evidence of families with children within this neighborhood. It appears to have just been childless adults. As expected, this is not a surprise, there was broad access to mass-produced consumer goods in this neighborhood across time. There was a high frequency, again, this is not really a surprise, given the urban setting and the time period, there was a high frequency of non-perishable food and beverage containers, very little evidence of more locally produced goods. The one interesting thing, or sort of unexpected thing, was that at two of the sites, 843 and 845, there was a surprisingly high frequency of marsh bird faunal remains, particularly from the order Sicaniform, which includes birds like heron, ibis, stork. And so the question is, well, you know, these people, all the other meat was clearly professionally butchered, but then we have all this evidence of wild game. Now, the sample sizes are relatively small, so it's possible that it's just a fluke. But I have a couple of ideas, a couple of hypotheses about why this might be. Number one is, again, these deposits were mostly dating from the 1930s and 1940s. And so maybe during the Great Depression and World War II, people had to find alternative ways of coping with food shortages. The other idea that I have is that Lucas County actually has quite a bit of marsh bird habitat, both in the rural eastern part of the county, which is right along the Lake Erie shoreline, but also right along the Maumee River, which runs right through Toledo. So it's not a stretch to imagine that even people living pretty close to downtown might have had access to this kind of food, and maybe it represents some kind of local traditional foodway. Those are both just hypotheses. We definitely need to do a lot more historical research, and obviously I'd love to get my hands on some other sites in the city to test these ideas out. In terms of utilities, the archival evidence suggests that this neighborhood was electrified in the 1880s. We didn't find anything archaeologically to suggest that it happened any later than that, or rather any later than the 1890s. But unlike electricity, the water lines to these houses appear to have been installed at different times over a much longer period. And as I've already mentioned, it's pretty clear that the cisterns, they were abandoned probably around 1920 or a few years earlier, but they sat empty and then were only used for trash disposal in the 30s and 40s. So just some final thoughts. First of all, this was the first excavation of urban sites in Toledo. There have been some phase 1 surveys, mostly around the less developed suburban fringes of the city. There was one relatively large survey that was done in the 90s for a highway that never got built, that did go sort of close to downtown, but it was just a phase 1 survey. There were no actual excavations. So this was the first real urban excavation in Toledo's downtown area. So it provides a nice baseline for, hopefully, future excavations. The second one here, I think this is probably pretty common to any data recovery that's done on within a tight timeline and with a small budget. I really wish that we had, some of the features that we excavated for the data recovery turned out to be not all that interesting. We were trying to sample a variety of different types of features, but if I could go back and do it over again, I would say, screw that. I'm gonna investigate the interesting stuff. I'm gonna dig within the house foundations, because that's where all the really cool stuff was. For any students in the audience, the artifacts are at the University of Toledo. They are available for research purposes. I think that was a really nice benefit of this project. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'd like to say thank you to everybody, especially our presenters today, who gave us a really nice snapshot of some really interesting current research going on in Ohio right now, and who also kept to schedule, because we're actually running a few minutes early, which is kind of unheard of. So I appreciate all of that. And I would also like to suggest that anybody who presented today or elsewise has work they'd like to get published in one of our journals or online through the Ohio Archaeological Council, to talk to Brian Redmond, who I think I saw here right over there, about how you might go about doing that. I highly encourage you to put all of your research in there. It would be really great. It's an open access peer-reviewed journal that gets a pretty wide readership. So we're actually going to take a break now. We're going to stop the live stream in a moment. We will come back here and reconvene at about noon, or right about there, to begin our business meeting, which is for members of the council. So if you're not a member, I don't think you can stick around for the meeting, but we'd love to have you come back and meet us up at the High Banks Metro Park at, I think I said 2 o'clock, and Eric can put up a map and a little image to show you. We're going to take a little walk around the park out there today. And one more plug, if you are not a member of the council, please consider becoming a member. There's information on our new and amazing and up-to-date website about how you can do that. And if you have questions, you can certainly reach out to me or who's the chair, right here, and I'm sorry? Justin, I'm sorry. Names and Justin will help you navigate that as well. So right, I think we'll go ahead then and end the live stream, although I think, did I see a hand? Does someone have, oh, sorry, that's the teacher in me. Did I see a hand up? Eric will share just a few images of the park that we're going to reconvene at, and then we will take a break and get ready for the Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
Sorry, Justin. I knew you were.
Sorry, I didn't have the Google map pulled up here, but the internet's working with me here. Yeah, so we're going to reconvene after the business meeting. Business meeting is going to go from 12 to 1, and I'm going to hold us to that 12 to 1 ideally. And then we'll reconvene at 2. For those of you that want to join, we're going to be doing a hiking tour of the High Bank Earthworks. Not the ones in Ross County, the ones in Delaware.
Okay, not a hard hike. We're not going up the mountain.
Yeah, well, I say hike because technically it's a walk, yeah.
We'll stroll in the park.
But we will be meeting at the Overlook Trail parking lot, which if you're coming off of 23 here, you'll drive in this way past the Nature Center, and then if you get in the split in the road, you will still end up there just as long as you turn left at some point. And then there's Overlook Trailhead parking. It's about 0.8 miles to the beginning of the earthwork from the trail, and it's about 2 miles total. I've already walked it already, and I tried to walk at a variable pace to see how it would be. So it should be about an hour, and we'll be focusing mostly on the earthwork that's down here. The High Banks observation deck is the end point of the tour.
You said there's some artifacts in the Nature Center too.
Yeah, I'll point that out on the walk as well. But if you want to see some of the excavated artifacts, those will also be in the Nature Center, which is about a 5-minute walk from this parking lot right here. But that's where we're going to be reconvening at 2 p.m.
And you are also going to attempt to live stream this too, right?
We'll see. We'll see.
Depending on the connection.
The trees might not cooperate with me, but we'll give it a shot. But that's going to conclude the live stream. So thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, I got to do my outro here. Thank you so much, everyone who's joined us on the live stream. That's going to do it for today. And
thank you very much.
I encourage you all to check out the website if you haven't already. So thank you so much. We're going to